With the introduction of the original iPhone, a premium flagship line was born. For 6 years, that was the core strategy. One polished phone per year, and if you got a knack for fancy goods, go buy an iPhone. Their value proposition of premium devices was working perfectly. In the beginning, of course. And there's a reason for it. Apple's biggest competitors were Nokia, Sony Ericsson, BlackBerry, Samsung, and other manufacturers. But Nokia was the big one. Instead of considering the decline in their portfolio, they were insistent on their tried and true formula. Main mistake Nokia made was sticking to Symbian, their proprietary mobile operating system. Their inability to adapt was their eventual downfall. But within those 6 years, someone had been rising slowly but surely. With the release of iPhone 4S, Apple needed to reimagine their strategy. Their competitors were offering devices at basically every price point. You can only pretend too much before the bubble bursts. They then decided to tap into the budget market with iPhone 5C. C stood for color. 5C was the budget option with plastic construction and various color offerings. However, it didn't do that well. Many people tend to say it was a flop, and while it was significantly underwhelming, it was alright. I believe there were a number of factors for its mundane sales. Two of these main factors were you could get a competent budget phone if you were conscious of that, so you didn't have to get the iPhone 5C. Second, and the biggest one, was Apple's target audience. After garnering customers who wanted the premium offerings, of course they didn't want to buy a cheap plastic budget phone. It was their first try to appeal to a different demographic, but they abandoned this formula after the 5C. At least for a little while. They wouldn't try this for the next 5 years. So, why did I go on about the release of an ancient budget device? Well, Apple for the most part pretended they were the only smartphone manufacturer. They didn't acknowledge their competition, they didn't go on the offensive in the ad campaigns unlike their competitors, and they didn't compare their device performance, design, or specifications with their competitors. This mentality came with a very crucial aspect: customer retention. Try to lock each and every item, whether physical, theoretical, or conceptual, within the Apple's ecosystem. The other aspect was unwillingness to adapt. Closest rival, Galaxy flagships, ever since the debut, were coming with bigger screen sizes. But Apple took years to listen to their consumers' feedback and ditched the relatively smaller screens. In terms of hardware, Apple Watch was released in 2015 and AirPods in 2016. Two devices to add to their ecosystem portfolio. Their iMac were also compatible with iPhone. In terms of software, however, they had their proprietary apps and features like FaceTime, iMessage, AirDrop, AirPlay, etc. Every new device launch boasted features but used specific language to avoid comparison with alternatives. This behavior is fine, and Apple isn't the only company involved in this type of operational strategy. But the problem is, Apple isn't the only device manufacturer, and when cross-communication across different device types and operating systems is required, the experience can come across as subpar. Why wasn't Android able to do this? Build a competing ecosystem. When Apple was refining its strategy of retention in the late 2010s, we had a plethora of companies and growing businesses under Android. HTC, LG, Sony Xperia, Samsung, Motorola, Huawei, and even BlackBerry. And that doesn't even include the Chinese manufacturers and their parent companies. You could get a device at every price point, and every company made tons of devices for the subcategories of consumers. So, one company, one phone per year versus loads of companies and bajillions of devices every couple of months. Even if a company, say Samsung, wanted to build an ecosystem, it wasn't worth the effort or investment to build an entirely competent ecosystem for a tiny sliver of their customers. In addition, even if you could build that, your lower-end phones won't be able to be a part of that system because of their lower specifications. The experience across the brand would be so inconsistent. This gave Apple a very significant advantage. They knew the position they were in and the choice simplicity that it granted them. Inevitably, the flagship giant was able to capitalize on this. Now that we have the stage set, let's go through the timeline and see the flip side of this strategy. 2016, with the launch of iPhone 8 series and 10, the headphone jack was omitted because courage. 2018, Apple was exposed throttling the performance of their older iPhones because they didn't want the battery life to suffer. This was clearly a move to nudge the customers to buy the latest iPhones. So many lawsuits were filed after this. The conflict of interest was insanely deep. 2020, they removed the charger brick from the box because environment, but they'll happily charge you an exorbitant amount of money to buy it. Honorable mentions include same design for half a decade, no SD card, no customizations, no side loading, no iMessage or FaceTime support for Android, and no repairing assistance. Now let's go through the timeline of rectification. 2020, Apple introduces widgets 12 years after Android introduced them. Still not the same level, but better late than never. It was because fans were consistently asking for these features. 2021, FaceTime finally supported Android. I mean, you couldn't install the app or initiate a call, but you could get an invitation link from an iPhone to be a part of the call. 2023, Apple announces right to repair nationwide. 2023, Apple finally includes USB-C due to EU regulation. 2024, Apple is finally adapting RCS chats. 2024, because of another regulation, third-party app stores and potentially sideloading are coming, at least to Europe. Introduced back in 2011, iMessage was a secure alternative to SMS, exclusive to iPhones. RCS came out in 2008, but it was a protocol rather than a standalone app or app suite. Shortly after iMessage, Android or other platform messages were marked green. Blue bubbles for iPhones and green bubbles for Android. iMessage was amazing in terms of security, efficiency, and other multimedia features. Because Apple had a handful of iPhones to support, they were miles ahead of everyone. Samsung was the first major manufacturer to support RCS in 2012. As we discussed, the diversification of Android phones made RCS extremely inconsistent, but as years passed, it became the global standard of Android world. Next step was to convince Apple to adapt this protocol so everyone, including Android users, can have read receipts, tapping indicators, high quality multimedia attachments, and most importantly of all, security, or more precisely end-to-end encryption. After years and years of third parties, experts, and Google themselves trying to convince Apple to adapt, they weren't even batting an eye. In 2022, someone asked Tim Apple the reason why they don't bring rich communication services to iPhones, because he has to send some videos or pictures to his mom who has an Android phone. Tim's response was
tough, not to make it personal, but I can't send my mom certain videos, or she can't send me certain videos, and so we leave.
Buy your mom an iPhone.
This single statement sums up Apple's entire essence as a business. In addition, Mr. Cook said that he doesn't hear their users asking for this feature because they already have a genius, anti, or if you want to be generous, pseudo anti-consumer moves all around. Look, it doesn't matter what device you use, you have a use case and you have a device for that use case. Simple. But this practice must be pointed out. That was their stance as of 2022. Behind the scenes, EU descended from the heavens and forced Apple to include USB-C. That's not the only thing they were forced to do. You see, Europe's Digital Markets Act, or DMA, forced Apple to comply with pro-competition practices. Developers will be able to push their in-app offers alongside iPhone's App Store. This could also potentially result in allowing side-loading apps. In September 2023, Google made this ad called iPager. I consider this to be the most useful thing Google has done in its lifespan. This ad hilariously mocks Apple for still using SMS and not adapting RCS. Please watch it, it's extremely funny, link in the description. In November, Nothing announced their iMessage service, which was going to use a Mac device in a server farm to disguise your device. This would result in blue bubbles all around. But as soon as it launched, security experts were tearing it down and Nothing took this down immediately. Shortly after, almost as if Apple was messing with Nothing, it announced RCS support is coming in 2024. No, seriously, Apple, out of the goodness of their hearts, decided to support RCS, and there was no catch whatsoever and everyone lived happily ever. I couldn't even get through that take. Two catches to be aware of. First, the green bubbles still remain. And second, they won't adapt the security extensions that come with RCS. So, no end-to-end encryption for you, peasants. Apparently, they will work with GSMA to develop a more standard and global end-to-end encryption. 75% of entire smartphone market isn't global enough for Apple. But this is still a huge step in the right direction. In December, Beeper was launched. an app that can convert your green texts into blue texts without the need of any Apple hardware. Best part, it was end-to-end encrypted. Given how recent the concept was, the app felt like it went through several iterations of development. Guess what happened? Apple blocked Beeper's functionality. Beeper found a workaround, but Apple was swift in its response to halt the app again. What was their reason? They were trying to block techniques that could exploit fake credentials to gain access to iMessage. It posed significant risks to users' security and privacy. Pause the video here to reflect on that statement. Before we discuss the absolutely abysmal logic here, these are legitimate concerns. In theory, a relatively unknown third-party app and developers could take advantage of these workarounds. Okay, so you blocked them. Good, right? Everything's secured. Without the app, you are sending and receiving unencrypted SMS and multimedia attachments when you communicate with Android. You know, the things that can be intercepted in the middle? They sell you a concept of privacy and security, but it's actually a locking mechanism disguised as a peace of mind. If they really wanted privacy and security, they would provide their own implementation. But no, 13 years have passed without encryption, and as soon as they saw a threat to their ecosystem, they immediately took them down. Beeper CEO Mr. Eric has mentioned that their project is open source and the company is happy to provide their code to Apple for inspection. From what I've seen online, everything is encrypted and Beeper never gets access to the decryption keys. As of now, Beeper has seemingly given up on the project, and I don't blame them. I can understand not wanting to go after a $3 trillion company. The concerns Apple mentioned with security and privacy were just as valid before Beeper. Let's take a moment to give massive kudos to Beeper, the devs and team members for standing against questionable business, competition, and consumer practices. Also, let's look at a teeny tiny side effect of this entire ordeal. Beeper brought massive media attention to the issue they were trying to solve. Before this, the talks regarding encryption and iMessage on Android were extremely dormant, but concerns have been raised if this move from Apple is anti-competitive behavior. Certain US lawmakers are requesting Department of Justice to investigate. There are two major approaches to security. First is to limit the functionality, and the second is to build tight interconnected security tools, standards, policies, procedures, and consistently monitor for any vulnerabilities. Both have their pros and cons, but the former is Apple's bread and butter. To give Apple credit, when you want to have an all-rounder phone that anyone can use from your grandma to your average tech enthusiast, it makes sense to go with limited functionality. Not everyone's gonna update their phones ASAP, or look for trusted apps, or malicious links, or monitor their phones, or know the specifications or the inner workings of their phone. But when that approach assists Apple to charge people subscription fees, limit the repairability, charge royalties on lightning cables, be unfair to devs, or use 3-decade-old standards when communicating with different devices, I think it defeats the purpose. You're relatively secure, sure, but are you being consumer friendly? Just within the past couple of years, we had these crucial developments. Pro-consumers moves all around. So, great job, Europe. It's also coming up for regulations around AI. I love the idea that EU can just force tech companies to be more reasonable and consumer friendly. Otherwise, the $3 trillion company did not have any intentions to make things consistent across the board. I talked about this a little in my iPhone 15 Pro Max review, but I'll repeat it here as well. Androids and iPhones are becoming more and more similar in terms of what they can do and what features they have. We have to hold these two on the same pedestal. It's okay if you use one or the other, but we must hold companies accountable when it comes to consumers and competition. With that being said, this is Roguehead. I hope you guys enjoyed this perspective. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you guys later.